Hello and welcome, everyone. This is ActInf GuestStream 15.3, lucky number 3 with Bobby. We're here with Bobby Azarian as well as some guests. We're going to have a discussion, talk about a range of different topics. It's June 1st, 2023. First, Adam and Michael can introduce themselves. Then Bobby will pass it off to you for sharing your screen and facilitating this however you see fit. So, Adam, go for it.
Hello, I'm Adam. I am a research fellow at the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Long-standing interest in the free energy principle, consciousness, free will, psychedelics, artificial intelligence, and along the way, I met and befriended Bobby, and I guess proud to be part of the movement. So,
thanks for coming, Adam. Yeah, Adam. I wish we would have time to get into this today, but Adam has presented a pretty clear mechanistic model of free will, cybernetic free will, and there's just this huge problem where, and I'll keep this short. We're gonna introduce Michael, but basically the main kind of straw man against free will is that there's this argument that you have this non-physical mind doing like stuff outside of causality, and that's why everyone's rejecting it as not a scientific idea. But of course something can't work if it's not it doesn't have mechanism. If it's not real, it's not real. So it's kind of a ridiculous debate to have if you want to talk about what people are talking about when they discuss free will. In the past, we didn't have mechanisms to understand what that was, but now we understand things like top-down causation, we understand control, and when you have that language, you can actually talk about what free will is in a mechanistic way, and that just changes the debate completely. That's not enough to convince people that, you know, there's something called free will, because there's a lot of issues that we get into, but Adam's one of the people that have been taking this nebulous concept and have been trying to show that there's actually a very specific set of mechanisms, and it's nothing outside of science, but it is science that is outside of our current paradigm. It's just dynamics that we don't normally, that weren't included in the previous model. So it looks like magic, but it's actually, there's stuff going on there. So yeah, we're going to have a longer discussion with Adam in the future, either on my channel, or maybe we'll come back and make it all about free will because it's such a big topic. But yeah, thanks for coming. And I invited Michael as well. So
yes.
Yeah, you want to...
Am I supposed to take the wheel now? Yeah. Obviously, I'm a fan of Bobby's. I very much like... Oh, well, I think it's important. I think the work that Bobby is trying to articulate, and Adam, I'm a fan, so this is the first time we've met, but I've watched some of your stuff as well, and Daniel, obviously, we've talked. Yeah, let's just yield to Bobby and let's see where we go here.
Yeah, Michael has a background in kind of system science and those kind of things. That's how we kind of resonated, is kind of like the system science approach, but thinking about how system science can be applied to like psychology and organizational issues. So how to make this stuff that's very theoretical practical. And so we're kind of working on that on the side. And then Brendan Dempsey will be coming and joining the conversation. Since he's not here right now, I'll just give a little introduction for him. He's the author of a book called Emergentism, and he has a Facebook group called Metamodern Spirituality. And basically he's, in that book, he's turned this emergence paradigm, which is basically kind of the opposite of the reductionist paradigm, into something like a sort of secular religion. And so he's talking about a lot of these same things. So he'll join us shortly. Probably, I think he's watching the stream and is trying to get into the Zoom link. So yeah, we can start. It'd be great for this to be sort of a discussion. So if anything I say triggers any sort of thoughts or criticisms, please speak up, because I don't have an organized set of slides. And there's a lot to talk about. And the problem really when I was trying to make these slides was like everything I say kind of gets into something else. And so I had like 100 slides and I was just trying to organize them in the last minute. So I think, I have some slides that were made in the past for other presentations that are just going to be kind of like a roadmap, but we can veer off of that. And I'm going to be saying a lot of stuff that's not in the slides. Yeah, so I guess we can start. So I'll share my screen because I just shared my screen from my computer and I couldn't see you, but I think the trick to that is to share my screen through Zoom and then do like slideshow, and then I should be able to see your faces on the side. Yep. Okay, so you can see my screen now? And
yep.
Then if I do slideshow, it doesn't cover you up. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. So
Bobby, just before you get started, I believe Brennan's joined us as well.
Hey, Brendan.
We warmed up the crowd.
His audio's, yeah. His audio's probably not connected yet. But yeah, so we can just begin. Hey, Brendan, I introduced you, and
yeah, I caught that on the YouTube version, and then I got the link. So great! It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Please feel free to like chime in at any time because I really need help here. I'm not like prepared to do this by myself. So, and maybe you can play the role of the critic too, because I should have invited some like anti-free will people because, or just some skeptics of these ideas, because what I realized is like, I'm saying these things, a lot of them were the things in my book, The Romance of Reality. And I make that argument as clear as I can, but then people have criticisms that for whatever reason, how I worded it, don't address those. And then they're not convinced. And then I do nothing to convince anyone who doesn't already believe this. So it's actually a lot more fruitful if there's a sort of this dialectical debate, like this dynamic, because then you hear both sides and then I can actually address the things that people think are the issues that might, cast doubt on some of the things that I'm arguing. So, the teleological stance. So this is the name of the self-help system, for a lack of a better term. I know people hear self-help and they think, that's something like cheesy and new age or, BS. And there are a lot of like, snake oil salesmen in this place. And I think that's why it's so important that we try, if possible, to create something like a self-help system and, something almost like a religion, like something that has practices and a sort of instruction manual for living based on scientific principles. Now, it doesn't have to be based on, science won't explain everything or address everything. But this provides a foundation where we can actually start to build a logic where we can go, some of these things are right and some of these things aren't. And we can start to see things that have been said in folk psychology or new age practices that people just considered to be non-scientific or pseudoscience. We can see how that maps on to some of these newer mechanisms that we're understanding, because now we're starting to look at biology and neuroscience and psychology from the perspective of information theory and thermodynamics. And these are like revealing new mechanisms that I believe can create a bridge between reductionist science and the higher sciences, but also a lot of these statements you'll hear, things that you hear in like spiritual circles, or people are doing practices or, and, just different little things that they find to be very effective. In most cases, there's a scientific explanation for why those things are effective. And most science-minded people are ignoring all that stuff. So they're like throwing out all of these things that emerged because they were adaptations, like practices, community building, things like that are just completely being ignored. And that's really bad. It's just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And as long as we have that mentality, scientists, they may say, I don't want to promote religion, organized religion, let's say, or, like kind of new age spirituality. I don't want to promote that, but they're actually helping keep those things in existence, because a lot of regular people are hearing this scientific worldview that's the mainstream worldview, and it's very nihilistic in some of its beliefs. And that'd be okay if that's how reality was, but we're going to see that a lot of these are based on mistaken assumptions, and people are rejecting that worldview because it doesn't offer anything of value to them as a normal person, and they will opt for other less evidence-based worldviews or philosophies because they're not getting that from that. So science is actually helping, like pseudoscience and things like that, if they want to keep science isolated from all of these practical things and sort of addressing bigger existential and even spiritual questions. And so if we can do that, if we can build that bridge, it would be good for unifying everyone, but it would also cut down on a lot of the pseudoscience and stuff that people are trying to kind of prevent from, not going there. But actually, I think that's part of the problem, if that makes any sense. So this is stuff from my Substack Road to Omega. Go there and check it out. There's posts on the teleological stance that break this down in more detail than I'll be able to give here today. I have this word in this slide, poetic metaнаturalism. If you're familiar with my book, you might have seen that. It's not really important to really talk about why I call it that, but let's just say there are these two distinctive worldviews. So there's the old mainstream scientific worldview, which is the reductionist worldview, which I think is basically a nihilistic worldview. And there are a lot of assumptions built into this worldview based on just we had limited knowledge at the time of how the world works. So there were things like, for example, when we thought the world was Newtonian, you just couldn't get away from determinism, this kind of strict Laplacian determinism. Laplace basically took Newton's kind of framework and tried to apply it to everything. It's really interesting that Newton himself didn't do that. He didn't think that his laws applied to life. And Newton was actually very religious and thought there were all these crazy hidden messages in the Bible, which is neat and kind of like covered up because people, don't want people to know that Newton was so religious. But so Laplace kind of, created this deterministic philosophy. And when we thought that was the truth, then there was no room for human agency. There was just one future trajectory, and we couldn't do anything to change that. And we weren't really doing anything to begin with. It was everything we do is sort of illusory, and we can talk about determinism in greater detail. But that's one nihilistic aspect, is that we don't have any agency and we don't have free will. Free will, it's a bit more of a loaded term. There's just assumptions with that word, like with the word free, that make it a little bit more of a contentious subject. But with determinism in the strict sense, no one could have any agency. So it kind of, if you accept that scientific proposition, then you're like basically accepting that you have no control over the future or your life. And that can be very depressing and demotivating. And there are studies that we can talk about that have shown that that belief actually causes people to, for example, behave less morally. They will be more likely to cheat because they don't have culpability, because no one's responsible for anything. That's them basically choosing to not have this agency. That I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. But basically, I mean, the fact that you can tell them that and then they lose it and then they start behaving more immorally, it's obvious that there's something causal there that's changing their behavior. So that's kind of a clue that picture, something doesn't make sense there. And it also causes people to be like really depressed and have kind of existential meltdowns. I personally had, when I thought determinism was the only explanation that made sense, I sort of had, times where I would have these experiences where I was very disturbed by the fact that I had no control over anything, and that this was sort of a tape that was determined from the initial event, and that I was just playing that out. It can be very disturbing if you take this stuff seriously. And what I'm arguing is that a lot of the scientists preaching this stuff, they're not taking it seriously because they can't. It would be, your life would just be over if you really believe that you had no agency, because you would stop doing stuff.
I tried taking it seriously, and it took me out for a good 2 years.
How do you even take it seriously? Like, what does that do? What do you do then?
It happened. It was a combination of reading this book, The Meme Machine, I think by Susan Blackmore, and Darwin's Dangerous Idea. There was this one sentence that just like took me out. It was like, everything up to this moment, including your genes, environment, and all your experiences, including the first half of the sentence, will determine how you interpret the second half. But it was sort of like just this web of causation being described on a different level of analysis, sort of like bringing that to the foreground. And I was like, and not seeing me in that foreground. And then I was like, oh, wait, there isn't like a neuron in my brain that knows or cares that I exist as a whole, and then was, so sodium ions are going to sodium ion. They're just going to follow those gradients. Like, oh God. And it just sort of had me. And so for a while,
does it kind of paralyze you, or did you just go, I'm going to do what I was going to do anyway, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to have this weird sort of, experience at the same time because it's all meaningless. I'm just going to go through life. I'm probably going to look really sad, but I'm going to do everything that I plan to do otherwise. Or does it just shut you down where you're like, I'm not going to get out of bed?
There was kind of like a double consciousness about it too, because it was like I'd be moving between having that as a frame, but then like to take action, you're like, you can't.
You just got to throw it out the window.
And so on occasion there would be kind of like a maybe this I don't think it took me in an unethical direction, but kind of like a fracket mindset, like nothing matters anyway, so woo. But
yeah,
but that didn't really stick for me.
Can I offer a devil's advocate take here? And yeah, I don't know if we're derailing or
no. This is perfect.
Thick of it.
This is great.
But and it is very much a devil's advocate position, because I think Bobby, you and I are very much aligned on trying to emphasize the importance of free will, the causal power of information potentially, etc. I'm sure you might get into some of that. But I will say this in its favor, or in addition to what's being said. So I also had an experience like that of suffering from the seeming implications of the deterministic universe. But I do think that there's a way of also allowing all of that to be the case and responding differently. And there are a number of different ways that can look. There's the Nietzschean approach to this, which is actually kind of taking this deterministic cycle and kind of the eternal recurrence of the same as sort of a wild yes saying to existence. And I'll just throw that out there and bracket it. We could come back to that one. What do you mean by that, though? Sorry, I don't. So
Nietzsche
he would philosophize while walking, or he would think his philosophy while going on these long walks and everything, right? And one day he was walking in the Swiss Alps and he sees this gigantic rock. And he comes to this sudden realization, and I guess I won't get into the whole story because it would probably be a little bit too much. But basically, the realization that springs there, which he has when at this sort of like monolithic scene, is somehow he's sort of transported and appreciates that what he would need to do was affirm his existence under the assumption that everything that has happened and will happen over and over and over again for eternity. all the mistakes, all the ecstasies, etc. It was all there. Almost, you could kind of think of it kind of in the there's the Big Bang, Big Crunch model, and then it repeats. And so, let's say something like that is happening, where it just
he
repeats
called
over
it
and-
eternal recurrence.
Right.
I mean, yeah,
a eternal recurrence. And he basically said that we need to be able to positively affirm that in an exuberant sense. And actually, and here's I
But
think
what does
the
that
point.
mean?
Well, what it means is that if you take the idea seriously, that this is your life and you are therefore radically responsible in some ways for what you experience. And I'll come back to this in the sense of what responsibility could mean in this context as well. Then it actually imbues everything with an incredible significance, because this is what you'll be experiencing over and over again. The second thing I wanted to say, which I think might kind of preempt some of your kind of like, well, how does that work, right? How can you be responsible? Is I do think that there's a phenomenological way that you can come to terms with determinism that basically concludes something like, okay, even if mechanistically this can be describable in terms of deterministic cause and effect all the way back, my experience of it is rather different. I have the experience of free will. I feel as if I can choose as I want to. And so there's no necessary reason why some descriptive framework needs to impinge upon my own phenomenological sense of reality. So for a long time, I made peace with this question that way, by basically saying, yeah, it's all determined, but I feel as though I have free will. And that's really, I think, the core there, because
let me say something about that. And I don't want it to seem dismissive. But I mean, this is not your idea anyway, so I don't really have to apologize to you. It's Nietzsche, and it's one of the possible things that I think you're considering. But I mean, I we've talked about this. I think we have similar ideas about agency. What I want to say about that is basically that is similar to compatibilism. And what's going on is that these people there's language games, first of all. Like, if you want to talk about that, if you believe that causal story in the strict sense, and it's more complicated that, because I'm saying that there is causality. There's always cause and effect to everything, and that doesn't not permit agency. But what I'm going to say is the kind of magic ingredient to understanding how this can be, a mechanistic idea, or a mechanistic process, how free will can be explained as part of the causal chain. We need to talk about top-down causation, and that's really the game changer. But without top-down causation, I don't think there is any responsibility. And what I think that Nietzsche and others are doing is first of all, they're compartmentalizing. They're not fully taking the determinism they're talking about seriously. And if you do that, like you have to compartmentalize if you believe that, because like Adam said, like you have to throw that out when you actually want to take action. So first of all, everybody who believes in determinism is kind of living a split personality life, and that leads to all kinds of cognitive dissonance. But it's worse than that. I mean, you still are?
I mean, in a way, it depends. So like, I'm agnostic about determinism in terms of like, that was part of, but it wasn't agnosticism about determinism, but going more deflationary on causation, or more instrumentalist on causation.
And I do think there's
but I'm open to there being like a best causal handling, or like there could be like a new like gestalt shift for me, where like causation kind of like enters into physics in like full majesty, and like
that's what this is. That's what I want to describe.
But the move for me was compatibilism via instrumental causation that kind of stays within, as like Carol's like, it stays in its lane.
Yes, and so I will put out a thing out there where you could have determinism and have true agency too at these higher levels. You would still need top-down causation, but you might not need any indeterminism at the most fundamental level, like quantum indeterminism. And you could still have potentially agency, and that's sort of Adam's perspective, or like he says, he's agnostic on it, but in the future, I hope to convince Adam that there's a better solution.
I'll take
And
it.
so what I was saying to Brendan is that these are language games. When he's like, it's truly this way, it's this way, but that should make you feel like you're responsible because this is, the life you have and the one you're going to repeat or whatever, it's good reasoning. Brian Greene says similar stuff. And that's why I say this. Brian Greene's like, the decision is real, but it's not really you making it, but it's a real, like a lot of strange, weird language games that if you actually make language the focus, which I wanted to do, but it's way too abstract. Like I didn't have time to nail that down for today, but that's what I want to do in the future. And you can show that people who are talking about this stuff, especially people who are, trying to find some sort of silver lining to determinism, they're using words inconsistently. They will use a word one way and then contradict it. They might even use the same word in two different ways in the same sentence. But basically, you can't have, well, I'm going to let you respond, Brendan, but I don't think there can be in that model any true responsibility. And then this solution of like, but I feel like I have it. To me, it doesn't give you anything additional. Like you're just an epiphenomena. And to me, that can be almost worse. Like he's given a nice spin on the positive way you can see it. But there's other people like illusionists that say, yeah, we have this phenomenal experience. It feels like I have free will, but there's absolutely no responsibility. Like Sam Harris is like, I don't have pride. A friend was just talking to me about this because he's a Sam Harris fan, but he's turned off by this whole no free will thing. And then he hears Sam Harris contradict himself all the time because Sam Harris will say, you don't have free will. And the whole thing is on free will. And then there's a little commercial for his podcast where he goes, you have the freedom to choose to listen to this podcast. And it's like, you're using double talk like constantly. So
I think it's very notable Sam Harris does not tell that to his daughter.
And he says
Sarah
that
and Annika, they they say it to each other.
But he says, I'm not going to tell my kids because it's going to make them, behave differently and like all these bad things that I said. But when they grow up, I'll tell them that they don't have any agency when they're ready for it. But what I'm saying is all of that is absolutely ridiculous talk. It's absolutely nonsense to be like, she doesn't have age. I'm not going to tell, like everything he's doing is the whole argument's completely self-defeating in every way. And there's a lot of people that have tried to make nice stories out of it, but ultimately they're contradicting themselves, and compatibilism in its current form is a contradiction. And people call it out for that all the time. But that doesn't stop the compatibilists because it seems like the best answer. It goes, yeah, but I experience this agency, so it has to be real on some level. But then how can we go against this determinism? It seems to go against causality in general. So it's like a lot of people like Dan didn't, their solution is like, I'm not going to go against these sorts of like, I'm not going to go against determinism or causality, which I'm saying it doesn't go against causality, but they think the best solution is to try to do some magic and make both these things work together. Yeah, so we can talk more about that, but yeah, Brendan,
may I?
maybe you have a response to that, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to throw in, something that we had grounded this in before was the idea that, we choose not to act on the back of that, right? So there's that balance of, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like
if you believe that, it's going to affect your behavior too. And what I'm going to argue is that you won't exercise your agency as much as you would if you don't believe it.
Along those lines, part of what really concerns me about the anti-free will rhetoric is because like an agency, like active inference, that like Carl sometimes say, like, there's a certain optimism that's required, like that's just built into it for the way you pursue goals by predicting them into being. And so like if you stop believing in yourself as a cause, being able to predict certain goals, that actually could be a real problem.
I believe it is a real problem, and that actually these people living this are already not behaving optimally, not making decisions optimally. Here's the thing, though. You may say, Sam Harris is a really successful guy. How do you explain that? It's because he's living he has a split personality. The part of him that is pumped about doing all this stuff, it's disconnected from the part of him that really believes that he has no agency. And you've seen that in those studies where they will like, you see people lose that belief and it changes their behavior. So my point is, if that's the way reality is, then we have to tell the truth. And that's what Sam Harris says. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. But what I'm saying is that idea is built on a mountain of language ambiguities that are creating this problem, and just a misunderstanding of causation. Because if you think all causation is bottom up, which means that the system is not, there's no higher level control. And this is kind of getting into details that I need to give some more background for. But if it's all bottom up causation, then there is no room for agency. But if you have top down causation and the whole system is this control center, it's a cybernetic control system that's basically, we can explain this later, but what I will argue is that the evolutionary process accumulates knowledge, so adaptive information in biological systems, so predictive information about the environment. The knowledge, the adaptations that are being acquired through evolution correspond to genes and neural connections that basically encode information about the external world. And that's what starts to give a system agency. And that's why living systems behave differently than inanimate systems. And that is because the system has gained causal power. So the system as a coherent unit is starting to control the components that it's made of and the trajectory that the system follows. And so, for example, Philip Ball is a journalist who's been writing about this a lot, like one of the most respected science journalists. But if you drop a pigeon and a rock off a tower, the rock you can predict with Newtonian mechanics, you can with classical physics equations, you can predict the trajectory of the rock. You can't predict the trajectory of the bird. So there's something fundamentally different about those two things. And I'm saying that behavioral distinction is what we have to call agency. Now that doesn't get us to free will, but it shows us that there's some sort of causal difference between biological systems and inanimate systems. And this used to be attributed to vitalism. What I'm saying is that vitalism wasn't necessarily wrong. We just didn't know what that vital force was. And now we have a name for it and we call it information. So I kind of veered from the point maybe, but yeah, what was I can't remember what I was answering with that. Brendan, did you have anything else to say?
Sorry, Brendan. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe we should finish up the Nietzsche thing and then I should get into some slides and then we should come back to this.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick again, I think, Bobby, I think what you're articulating, I mean, having read your book and, talked with you a lot about your work, I think we're very much on the same page. I was very much also at the same time doing a devil's advocate thing, though, for a couple of reasons, and it would derail us too much from the present topic, which is more important than trying to make a devil's advocate case for living with determinism.
I told Daniel that
I'm a recovering determinist.
That's kind of what I want to do here, because I said if we don't hear the criticism, then the people who don't agree with this, I'm not going to answer. So I'm glad you said that. Yeah. But I would just like to push you a little bit more to explain.
Yeah.
If it's purely deterministic, where's the responsibility that Nietzsche's talking about?
Yeah. Well, let me say maybe a couple things too. That add further context here. There's sort of a tradition of, let's say, using historical, philosophical, or even theological categories and the kind of frameworks that those used to provide for making sense of really important concepts and ways of being in the world, and then presuming that if someone deviated from those, that there would be these natural necessary sort of implications that would flow from thinking differently about something. The classic case in my experience has been, oh, we need morality and moral facts to make us good people. As soon as you don't believe in moral facts, you'll become a terrible human being, and that's not true. People who don't believe in moral facts in the kind of traditional way can find all sorts of groundings for their morality.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt, but I can see like these language things going on like everywhere in these discussions. So, for example, so you're saying that people don't need morality and that these people, but then you said traditional morality. So that was the point I was going to make, is that the people who, let's say you don't believe that there's any purposefulness in nature, there's no teleology, so it's like everything is random and accidental. Then they go, well, you know what? That doesn't make me depressed. This is the only time this is all we've got. So I better make it count. There's no afterlife. So what I'm saying is they're still deriving morals from this paradigm, and they're actually deriving meaning and purposeful principles out of this. So they're really in a way they still see they're still finding what they need to find to behave in an optimal way. But what I'm saying is that that's kind of a teleological view, and they're not fully sticking to their paradigm with no assumptions. They're building on lots of assumptions, and you get this morality that ends up looking exactly like religion once you map it out. And you go, oh, yeah, like the golden rule, for example. The golden rule, you don't need a religion for the golden rule. You just need to know that you're an agent. There are other agents like you. They're like you. They also experience happiness and suffering. Therefore, I'm going to treat them like I would want to be treated. And also there's an incentive to do that, because then they can treat me that way. Then they'll treat me as I've treated them. But the golden rule could be a basis for a religion and a moral postulate. So are they really morally free of moral facts? Or are they creating a set of morals from a paradigm that's supposed to be completely moral free, but maybe it's not? Because what I'm saying basically is they're kind of converging on this kind of purposeful narrative without even realizing it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, I would say what you're getting at, which is important, which is there is often a performative contradiction that we're engaged in. We're asserting something logically, and then our actions are sort of, suggesting otherwise. I mean, if I'm a solipsist and I say, I believe in solipsism and I think this is right, it's sort of like, well, wait, why are you telling me that? So there's that element to it. There are actually, though, some rather detailed arguments you could make that get into things like, well, yes, I'm a solipsist, but I'm talking to you about it because you're a projection of me, and it's still worthwhile for me to have projections with my, conversational projections with myself, etc.
Yeah, but
and there are versions of that for the free will sort of a thing, right?
But I think there's fallacies with all of that. So, for example, let's say, and there's a old joke about the teacher gives a lecture on solipsism and why solipsism can't be refuted, and the student comes up to him after the lecture and says, oh, you're a solipsist too? Like, he's happy to meet another solipsist, but the whole point is that the other person doesn't exist, so you're happy to meet your. But so what I would say is, let's follow that anytime. Okay. So then we would do a little game where we break that down. And what I'm saying, when you start to break all those things down, they lead you back to the same road. So let's say you're not real, Brendan. You're a projection of my mind. But what does that mean? Brendan is a projection of my mind, but you're an agent and you have different beliefs than me as I know myself here. And you're going to do things, you're going to behave in ways that are different than I would behave, because you have a different set of beliefs ultimately compared to actually the me I know, even if you're really me. What I'm saying is that really me doesn't really have any meaning, because when you start to define you as this agent, even if you make this metaphysical claim that you're a projection of me, for all practical purposes, you are an agent within this system that has a different set of beliefs than what I know that behaves differently. So what I'm saying is even the thought experiment has this language flaw because you come back to the equivalence of it's not really a meaningful statement to say whether it's me or not. If it has all these properties, that counts as an individual agent in the reality that we can be aware of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think I agree. If we really followed this through, I think we would converge to the same point, which for me tends to be, well, I'll frame this a little bit by saying something like, Hume, you're just mentioning earlier about how, like, Sam Harris said, I wouldn't tell it to my daughter. Hume, skeptic, would question, well, will the sun actually rise, etc. But he made the point that basically once he puts his philosopher pen down and he goes and leaves his study, he's now living like a regular person. Now, you could say, so there's a potentially meaningful distinction between the pragmatism and the sort of intellectual, logical, coherence, let's say. But I do think that there's a meaningful way that we can actually collapse those in a way that should be collapsed because it would lead to something like what information about reality has causal power for sustaining my viability and flourishing in the face of entropy, right? Kind of tie back in some of this free energy principle, Bayesian updating sort of thing here, right? So, and this is the point that that you introduced me about the work of like Kolchinsky and Walpert, which I've made great use of thinking about meaningful information as being that meaning that a system produces by processing information about its environment that ultimately aids its viability, right? Now, if what we're talking about in a pragmatic sense has a deleterious effect on our viability because of our concepts, then we might say that actually is decreasing our viability, and therefore we might be inclined to say, if that's our sort of criterion for asserting information as being an accurate model of reality, which I'm not sure of a better one, then we could say that things like skepticism and solipsism are untrue on that ground. If that line makes any sense, you could really start to unpack that. But I think that might be where we'd ultimately converge in agreement on some of these points.
Yeah. So
5 minutes. I'm gonna have to run in 5 minutes, unfortunately. So I'll just throw in a couple of quick thoughts.
let me just say one sentence before I forget. Maybe I already forgot. Let's see. Okay, go ahead, Adam. I'll try to remember it.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So,
oh, sorry. Yeah, when you were talking about viability, like all these explanations, like, oh, well, maybe I don't have free will, but being optimistic has some positive effect. What I'm trying to say is if the micro scale determinism is true, and we're going to that's one point I want to make. There's determinism. When people are saying that word, it's conflating two different things. There's physical determinism that I'm talking about, like micro determinism, where everything is just this model, like where you have these atoms are basically pool balls and they're following these trajectories. Well, I'll get to that in a slide. But that's a different kind of determinism than saying that your genes and experiences give rise to what you do. My point is, if you're saying all these, if the micro scale determinism is true, there's no need to even talk about, oh, optimism helps me. There's no like, oh, even being optimistic is like all of that biological level talk is causally redundant. So basically, if there's micro scale determinism, genes even aren't determining anything. That's causal overdeterminism. You're saying, okay, the genes cause my behavior, but then you said the atoms cause my behavior. So my point is, if micro scale determinism is true, you don't even have genes determining your behavior. It's an incoherent argument. And Sam Harris is conflating these two types of determinism and flipping back and forth. So what I'm saying is we got to break this down. And what what top-down causation does is it overcomes this physical determinism. And then there's biological determinism that determines what agents will do. And I'm saying that consciousness and self-awareness, reflective thought is what overrides biological determinism. And that's when basically your higher mind, like this monitoring kind of prefrontal cortex, executive control, like the mind that's responsible for that. There's access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness distinction. So that mind can override your biological programming, your impulsive actions. And so when we have this hierarchical model, we see that there's two types of determinism at least, and then there's multiple types of top-down causation which overcome those things. So not to say that that argument doesn't hold up, like we have to talk about determinism as far as like your, genes determining your behavior. But my point is, if someone believes in micro scale determinism, then these higher level things, when people say, oh, your genes are deciding what you're doing, those things would also be epiphenomenal. Those would be shorthands, because you could actually look at the genes and you could see a bunch of particles, and then you could use Newtonian trajectories just applied to the particles. The genes are epiphenomenal now. The neurons are epiphenomenal. So it's a level of new. I don't know, Adam, have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, and that's kind of my part of my agnosticism is like, is there such a thing as a true atomism? Does causation even make sense if it's just like an undifferentiated like quantum field, for instance? Like, as soon as we're talking about particles or kinds of anything we can even name or pick out, are we basically coarse graining, and are we in kind of like a and then like when we say micro, why don't we just keep going? Like, isn't it already somewhat like an instrumental for a given purpose? But in terms of like, so like I've been like, and I've kind of kept these separate, like these issues of like the philosophy of causation, like the handlings of free will. So like I've tended to focus on like functional cybernetic free will, basically as like the planning and like the architecture of choice, and like being able to like suss out different options and evaluate counterfactuals that you then like have different control energy for the system. But I think there could be really interesting connections between how we handle causation, though, and where within the control hierarchy, and the way you're describing of like what's responsible for what. So like ways in which like system 2 can override system 1, or like
that's absolutely what I want to develop here, because I think you can bridge this low level causation discussion that I'm talking about, which, for example, Paul Davies and Sarah Walker have written about informational control, and that's with the origin of life. There's this change in the causal structure of the system, and then it gains this agency. And that's what I focused on a lot in part 1 of the book. And so what I'm saying is Adam's work focuses on basically this free will topic, where I'm saying that there's this even higher level system beyond just normal biological agents that comes with not just consciousness, but an ability to create counterfactuals and imagination. So it's like a prefrontal cortex sort of higher self. And a lot of people say the self's illusory. That's why I love to fall back on Adam's work, because it really breaks down the self from a mechanistic perspective. But that's exactly what we can do. We can look at the space of counterfactuals, and as we will see, that I think there is some indeterminism at the fundamental level of reality that propagates up, and that's what you see with chaos, even though it's called deterministic chaos, and that's a whole nother issue to get into. But basically, I'm saying that there are choices, and that the world's trajectory is not set in stone, and there's some variation. And when we as agents consider the space of counterfactuals and then choose something specifically, it may be something like we're going to make a choice, and then our biases, like our impulsive decision, is to make a certain choice, like reflexively, based on like how we feel and our genetic programming and our experiences. But then we can have another process where we go, okay, is this decision optimal given my principles? I have this higher self now. I think about like what's good, what I want to do, what are my long-term goals, and that is the mechanism that corresponds to what people mean when they talk about free will. And so I'm excited about that, and working with Adam to explain that to people who, are just think that there's no way free will can work, because he's talked about these mechanisms from this, cybernetic and computational neuroscience perspective and formalized them. People like Sabine Hossenfelder, like physicists, are like saying there's no way free will can be compatible with a causal picture of the world. I don't think that's true. But what I wanted, and Adam's going to leave, so he's unfortunately not going to be part of this, but he'll see it later. I think we can bridge Adam's work at this higher level to this low level causation stuff to actually have a causal story where there's actually still cause and effect, but there's higher level causation that can basically override the sort of the lower level bottom up causation. And then you even get these higher levels where you can have that sort of causation being overridden by conscious, like mental causation. So you would have bottom up causation and then top down causation and then mental causation. And top down and mental causation, they would all be like looped under, like, categorized under downward causation, or you could call them all top down causation. But there are differences when consciousness emerges that allows for what could be called new causal power. Things are working in a similar way, but you will see a behavioral change when you get consciousness that will allow for things like technology, things that require imagination, counterfactual generation that can't be achieved with lower level intelligence. And that we can actually construct a causal picture that is perfectly in line with everything we know about causality. But when you do this, you realize that the bottom up story, and I haven't really defined that, you guys know what I'm talking about, but I haven't defined it for the listeners, but that when you have this story of causation, you have agents emerge, and they're actually control centers that can initiate causal chains. And they do it for reasons. There's always reasons that you want to make a certain decision over another. So some people think because you have a reason, that's a cause, that somehow that's not free will. But if you didn't have a reason for it, you would be doing it randomly, and that wouldn't be free will either. So free will just has to be reconceptualized within this framework, and it's not full free will, but full free will wouldn't be free will in the first place, because again, it would be random if it was not based on a reason. But what I'm saying is that your reason, even though it's a cause, the reasons, it's not determined, because basically it's not determined in the same sense that people are talking about with physical determinism. We'll get to this. There's no way I can do it without looking at the slides, but if anyone has any comments about what I just said, and Adam, I know you got to go. So any final concluding thoughts?
I am furious that I have to go, but I'm looking forward to tuning in a bit. So talk to you soon.
All right. See you, Adam. Thanks for coming. And
Bobby,
yeah, Adam,
if I may, sorry, may I interject for a second?
Yeah, if anybody wants to read Adam's papers on integrated world modeling theory and cybernetic free will, you can just Google his name in those terms, and you'll see some great papers and some, really respected journals like Entropy, I think, is the integrated world modeling theory one. Yeah, Michael.
No, I was just, I'm just trying to, again, do my job here or whatever, but Daniel, I did want to ask your thoughts about, active inference at this juncture.
Yeah, any thoughts about active inference, how that applies to anything that we've said already? And I will link it to that soon, because I know a lot of listeners, that's what they're interested in.
I'll definitely look forward to how you link it. But although active inference is this incredible modern composable framework for, on one hand, cognitive modeling, and on the other hand, the actual embodied situational modeling, a lot of the reason why people get into it, get curious, start participating in the Institute is exactly the topic of self-help and self-improvement and personal decision-making amidst multi-scale uncertainty. And so there's, among the many gaps between theory and application or practice, one of them is utilizing these kinds of multi-scale information geometry, decision-making, moment of choice type frameworks for what? For what we actually do. So this is something that really strikes at the heart of what we do as Inference. And I'm just looking forward to how you frame it in this narrative, and then we can come back to some more technical details too.
Yeah. So we're going to cap it at 8. I guess at 7:50. I don't know if you'll have many questions in the chat. But I'm going to try to give the presentation in the next 45 minutes. But feel free to comment on stuff that will still be helpful. But I guess we shouldn't get too far into make a comment so we can mark it. I might give a little answer and then we'll come back to it. But I prefer that you speak up, because then we'll know what to come back to. So I'll say a few more things about causality because they're important. And then I'll get into kind of the bigger picture of the theory, and then specifically the self-help teleological stance, which is, the free energy principle comes into play there. And then we can talk about practical applications for the individual and for society, because the goal is that this system can be used. It's kind of like a theory of everything. So it explains reality, but that it can be used to improve your life as an individual, but also be used to figure out how to sort of optimize our social systems, political systems. So it kind of creates a logic that could be used to base like a political party on, like a third party or something, which would be great if we had a party kind of based on systems thinking. We kind of need a not like a bipartisan ideology right now that's not based on anything other than evidence-based things that we know can be used to optimize systems. Not that that's everything, but what I'm saying is it provides a foundation that then the ethical and kind of moral stances emerge from. And if you don't see this basic cosmic story, then you will be confused about ethical issues. And what I will argue is that folk psychology, ethics, all of that stuff, I believe is consistent with this view because it was kind of intuitive that this is the story of nature and that it will kind of ease that cognitive dissonance for people who have accepted the reductionist view. Like, I know a lot of people have accepted this view that there's no agency, that there's just the strict determinism, but then they want to use, this free energy principle type things to improve their life. But that's kind of a contradiction because are they choosing to improve it, or is there just one trajectory that's set in stone? And so I think that getting this stuff straight will allow people to embrace stuff like the free energy principle and apply it to their lives, because they go, okay, I can actually use this and I can do that and I can create change in myself and in the society I'm a part of. But with this old model, there's no hope for change because there's only one trajectory. And so if Nietzsche really took that seriously, it would be no reason to really talk about responsibility because it's just purely a block time frozen thing where the future's already determined from the initial state. And the fact that it would repeat over and over is just even more hell. It's like determinism was bad enough. Now you have to experience not having, an illusion forever. So what I want to offer is a different model that we can't fully get into, but what I have called eternal recursive emergence. And so that it's not a cyclical process. It's actually a process of the universe evolving and maybe giving rise to something new, potentially like a new universe. There's cosmological natural selection. We don't have to go there. We don't have to talk about like what anything outside of this universe. But my point is that, so what I want to show is that the universe is not an arbitrary system. It's not random. It is a system that exhibits a design. You can say it's the appearance of a design. Maybe it's not really design, but there's qualities that can't be explained. If the universe was the only universe in all of reality, you couldn't have that theory. Either there's a designer that designed it that way, or there's a larger reality with a multiverse that would explain this fine tuning. And that's where basically science went. They said, okay, it looks like there's a creator because of the fine tuning problem, but we can't accept that. So we have to consider this multiverse option. But the multiverse option is just as weird as a creator. It leads to all kinds of crazy things, like other universes where there's every possible version of you. So it probably has just as much baggage as the creator thing. But then there's cosmological natural selection, which basically is an evolutionary explanation where basically universes give rise to other universes. And there's this Darwinian selection principle that would lead to like a universe optimized for like complexity growth and life, essentially like spreading like continuously. So we don't really need to get in those metaphysical topics, but I just wanted to state up front that the universe does have something that we could call a design. But when I say that, don't assume that I am talking about it being created by some sort of conscious intelligent agent. It could be this evolutionary process, but it's not random. It's not arbitrary. And that's the big mistake, is that we have models of a random system like a gas. That's what Boltzmann used to kind of try to have a statistical foundation of the second law of thermodynamics. And the problem is we base the dynamics of that inanimate system. I mean, we understood the dynamics of that inanimate system, and then we assumed that the universe behaved the same way. And that led to all of these bad assumptions that created this nihilistic worldview. So let me talk about that first. If determinism is true, like if there were no indeterminism at the lowest level, for example, everything was just made of these atoms, and these atoms were like classical scale objects, like pool balls on a pool table. And that you have all these atoms, and if those atoms follow classical trajectories, and they're just like, basically you can imagine the universe as a table of pool balls, then there's no room for anything. There's one future trajectory, and it's set in stone. So if you believe that, if you accept that worldview, there is no other future. There's no changing it. And if you believe that, and you want to change your life, you have to, and you're really taking this seriously, you would have to ask yourself, well, if I change my life, am I really changing it? Or was this the way it was always supposed to happen? It was determined that I was going to change my life. Or are you saying like, it's determined in a way where you can't change your life, so you shouldn't even try? It leads to all these weird conclusions, but what I'm saying is that's not the way reality is. And that leads to like this worldview where you have no agency. You can't get around it, because if it's a purely pool ball universe, then there's no agency. Not only that, so that's the first thing. That's if the world was Newtonian at the micro level, there would be no agency. There would be one trajectory, and there would be this block time thing. It would just, everything would follow from the initial state in a way that was calculable from just specifying the positions of every particle and applying Newton's laws to those. And then we have some forces that interact, but it doesn't really change the picture. So there's just one continual trajectory. Then Boltzmann found that, an inanimate system, because in a gas, for example, so it's a specific type of system that Boltzmann was using to derive the second law of thermodynamics on a statistical foundation. And it's not the way open systems work. So first of all, we should know that. He showed with statistical mechanics that if you have a gas, so in a gas, every particle is uncorrelated. It's just moving around freely. And in his model, also people should know that this is before we understood the periodic table. Periodic table didn't come till like decades after Boltzmann did this work. So we didn't understand like chemical bonding, for example. We didn't understand a lot of things. So in his model, as an idealization, you used spherical, like what would be marbles, like spherical round things that bump off of each other elastically. So they just bounce off each other. They don't combine and interact with forces. And if you have this picture, if you have these things just bumping off of each other, interacting this way, moving around, following these classical trajectories, not bound in any way, you will get a transition from order to disorder if the system starts out in an ordered state, of course. Because the disordered state, there's more possible ways to do that. So if everything's moving around randomly, you see this trajectory here that we see. And then so the idea, but there were so many weird assumptions in trying to apply this to our universe. Like when you start to break them down, like none of them really made sense. So he was saying, okay, this is what has to happen. You go from order to disorder. And this must be the way the universe is, because this is what has to happen by statistical laws. If everything's moving randomly, if there's no magical forces doing anything, this is what happens. So the problem with that, basically, so one thing I should say is that's not even true. If this was the way the world is, and people pointed this out to Boltzmann, given enough time, if these are following these mechanical trajectories, even the disordered state will go back to the ordered state given enough time. This is Poincaré's recurrence theorem, kind of similar to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. But so the idea is that if you have the system behaving this way, basically all trajectories are possible. And given enough time, it will go from disorder and then will revert. And people challenged Boltzmann with this, and he couldn't get away from that possibility. What I lost my train of thought earlier. I didn't let you know. I just went on to the next thing. But what I forgot to say was that Boltzmann was like faced with the problem of, why does our universe look so complex if it goes from order to disorder? And then that's where, like, so he had to say, oh, well, it must have started out really ordered, because it can't go from disorder to order. So it must have been this highly ordered state, which was the beginning of time. It was this low entropy state. But now we know that after the Big Bang, everything was homogeneous. And then things started aggregating. So it was literally an equilibrium state, this fully mixed up high disorder state, something closer to that before that. And then things started clumping and you get more organization. So the story is completely the opposite of what we've been taught. Julian Barber, in his new book, explains this, that the trajectory of the universe is towards higher complexity and order. And that we made a mistake by applying this model of an inanimate system to the universe in its entirety, when the universe has all of these batteries in the sky we call stars, and they're driving systems away from equilibrium. So then we had Ilya Prigogine in 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970. I would say 50s and 60s were probably when he was starting this work and it was really gaining influence. But he basically showed that there's another dynamic where if you have a system of particles driven by a flow of energy, it will start to naturally organize that system, assuming that the molecules can bind to each other. So you need to have the right sort of molecular variety for this to happen. But this model of Boltzmann's didn't take into account bonding. It didn't take into account the force of gravity. It didn't take into account open systems. And what I'm arguing is ultimately that the universe's dynamics are more like an open system being pushed far from equilibrium, where it's self-organizing. So in this model, the universe isn't going towards disorder because it's not a universe made of particles that stay uncorrelated. So this Boltzmann's model was based on this H theorem, where everything stays uncorrelated. But when things interact, they become correlated. So this model works for gases, and it doesn't work for open systems. And what I'm saying is it doesn't work for the universe. We applied it to the universe. And if this was true, there's only one trajectory, which means there's no changing the future. What's going to happen is going to happen. And if that's the case, that's pretty depressing, because it kind of demotivates us to go, oh, you know what? I can change the world. I can have this idea and it can blow up, like Mark Zuckerberg, like creating Facebook. Like you could create something like Facebook and you would have that and you would change the world. But if you believed in determinism, it would be kind of strange. You would be like, wait, but this is already determined. So I already did it in a way. I'm already going to do it. And like, there's only one trajectory. And then I play that important role in history. No, that can't be true. I'm not going to, that's impossible. Like I'm going to change the world and it was determined. So that philosophy leads to a lot of weirdness that I'm saying completely dissipates when we get the causal picture straight and we see that there's not this nihilistic one trajectory because of quantum indeterminism. And that's not everything, but what quantum indeterminism does is it shows that when you shrink, when you zoom in and you get to a certain level, that Newton's laws of motion do not hold. You will see there will be no definite state of an electron that you can predict given its prior state. There's only going to be a wave function that gives a distribution of probabilities where that can go, and then you use the Born rule to find out where it's likely to go. And then if you repeat that study a bunch of times, you'll see these statistical patterns. But so what I'm saying is quantum indeterminism got rid of this picture of strict determinism at the micro level. And if you did have that strict determinism at the micro level, you would not have any agency or there would be no real counterfactuals. They would be sort of due to our epistemic limitations, what we can know about the world. We think there are different possibilities, but there actually are none. The world can only go one way. And what I'm saying is that there's a possibility space of things that can happen. And that when agents make decisions, you're carving out a path that in some way it's not determined by the microscale physics because of quantum indeterminism. And then we have chaos to at the classical scale where you can't predict what a chaotic system is going to do. People call it deterministic chaos. I have issues with calling that determinism because it's completely not predictable. And I don't even think determinism is the right word. People want to look up Norton's dome. If you have a ball posed at the top of the dome, there's multiple Newton's equations that can satisfy where it's going to go next. There's actually even determinism is not fully deterministic, but that's kind of beyond what we'll get into. So let me just try to go faster through the slides since it's 7:20. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of the details that I planned, but maybe our earlier conversation provides context that can clear a lot of this stuff up. So what I'm arguing is that the universe is self-organizing. And so Lee Smolin, popular physicist, says the possibility of conceiving the universe as a whole, as a self-organized system in which a variety of improbable structures exist permanently without the need of a pilot or other external agent. I can't see that word. So we have the possibility of constructing a new scientific cosmology. It's clear that if the natural state of matter is chaos, and external intelligence isn't needed to explain the order and beauty of the world. So he's basically saying if we had this model of like randomness, then it wouldn't make sense for us to see what we see, and we would need a creator would be a better explanation. But if life, order, and structure are the natural state of the cosmos itself, then our existence, indeed our spirit, might finally be comprehended as created naturally by the world rather than unnaturally and in opposition to it. And you'll see up here that he says a variety of improbable structures that exist permanently. So what I'm saying is there's some language issues here that we're seeing where we're saying, why do we see all this improbable stuff? If it's there, it's not improbable. So it's only improbable if we accept the old model based on, you know, this simplified model of causation that doesn't include top-down causation, which we'll explain, and that actually complexity that you would say that this is highly improbable, that complexity just keeps growing and growing and growing, because statistically you would think that there would be some transient complexity, and then basically you would have this trend towards entropy that, you know, this complexity would dissolve. What I'm saying is it's not, when I'm saying that the universe is becoming more and more complex, it's not opposed to naturalism. It's that our conception of naturalism is based on an outdated paradigm that did not include dynamics that really exist, that we're now just finding, so that these structures that are highly complex were never improbable. And I'm actually going to argue that they're statistically inevitable, that they arise in a way deterministically. And it might be kind of confusing that I use that word, but what I'm going to try to argue is that when we talk about determinism, we need to make distinctions between that as well. So what I'm saying is that there's strict determinism is not true, but I'm now going to argue that something like global determinism is true, which is a name that's been used by philosophers, that there are attractors that create these dynamics such that it is natural that the world goes towards increasing complexity, and that if we see this trajectory that we're a part of, you know, life is spreading, we're building technology, the biosphere has created all this complexity on Earth. If we spread, we're spreading complexity throughout the universe in the form of, like, you know, computational structures. Life is a computational structure. This information processing network that we call the biosphere is spreading. If life spreads, that was never improbable. It was just improbable because it seemed improbable because we didn't have all of the laws, and that actually it's inevitable. But that there is some freedom within that, but there is an outline that's basically deterministic at this larger scale. And by that, I mean, things can go a different way. Like if you rewound the tape of time and you played it again, that different events, there would be a slightly different chain of events that would happen. You would get different, for example, genetic mutations, because genetic mutation, and Schrodinger was the first person to speculate about this, but that there's a quantum component. So if you rewound the tape of time and you played it again, you would get some different genes. But what I'm arguing is because of these emergent attractor dynamics that were really explained by non-equilibrium physics and the work of Ilya Prigogine, then what you see is that you would get the same trajectory towards higher and higher complexity because there were other laws that we weren't aware of. And so in this model, there's going to be a sort of cosmic destiny that is this sort of form of global determinism. And then there's going to be free agency, that the agents can do things that's not set in stone within that kind of global deterministic picture. So it's kind of new. It's not, I'm saying that it's not binary. Is the world deterministic or indeterministic? There's indeterminism at the lowest level, which basically introduces slack into the causal chain. So not everything is fully determined in the strict sense. But because of these attractors, you get these emergent dynamics where you're going to see similar patterns, similar regularities. So Christoph Koch, just a couple scientists who, well, yeah, I'll skip this stuff. But so there are a lot of scientists who, a lot of philosophers who have had this kind of teleological narrative that the universe was moving towards some sort of goal, that it seemed to be like an organism that's developing. And that seemed like an idea opposed to naturalism. People like Teilhard de Chardin and Bergson were, in Chardin was religious, but Bergson was a philosopher that wasn't really. So I think a lot of these people got criticized wrongly. They're actually seeing what was right about nature, but this view was thought to be opposed to naturalism. That was teleological, and that had to be some sort of mystical force. And what I'm saying is, we just didn't know about certain things. We didn't understand information, and that these people were right, and that a lot of people will hear this and say, oh, well, that's against science. And that might be, again, they might think it's against the second law of thermodynamics or something. But no, there's a big misunderstanding about that. And all of these people are, all of the scientists on this page, really everyone with the exception of a couple of those philosophers, are extremely respected and very accomplished people who support this view. I mean, Ray Kurzweil, he's a technology guy. He's a little bit more out there, but he even uses the word destiny. It is clear that the physical laws of our universe are precisely what they need to be to allow for the evolution of increasing levels of order and complexity. Ultimately, the entire universe will become saturated with intelligence. This is the destiny of the universe. So what I'm saying is that this is the trajectory of cosmic evolution. This is the roadmap of the future. And this provides something like an outline for non-reductionist theory of everything based on emergence. So you have first physics and chemistry emerge, then biology, then brains, then technology, and then the merger of biology with technology. And then you get patterns of matter and energy, and the universe becomes saturated with intelligent processes and knowledge. So life expands, and we do that because we have to. We're going to run out of energy on this planet. Our star's going to die, which necessitates that we move outward, and then we extract the energy from that, and we keep moving outward. And as we do, the informational network that is life keeps expanding, and it keeps taking inanimate matter in the world and incorporating that into its computational substrate. So the island of agency, the island of information, keeps spreading and subsuming the inanimate world. And I'm saying that that is an inevitable process. And people say, well, that seems very unlikely. And if that's happening, then it's not part of the design, or it's not part of the code of the universe. Like, it's not necessitated by the parameters, the laws, and the constants. They'll say, it's just something that could have happened, and it's unlikely, but we're defying the odds. Now, when those people say that, they don't even realize their own ontology. Like, if they believe in determinism, then there's only one trajectory. There's only one thing that could happen. So there's no likely or not likely. If you really believe in determinism, there's no statistics, and there's really no causation. It's just one thing follows another. And people have talked about that. If determinism is true, then even causality is an illusion. It's just one sort of fabric of events that all follow from the initial event. So what I'm arguing is that the universe shows the dynamics of a far from equilibrium system, a driven system, and that it moving towards complexity isn't violating any laws, and it's not improbable. We just didn't understand far from equilibrium dynamics, and that the universe's complexity doesn't have to be transient. So Sean Carroll has this thing where he's showing like the increase in complexity and the increase in entropy. And people go, oh, okay, this is making sense. Complexity is not opposed to entropy. It's part of that, but it goes up and then it goes down. You have the coffee and you have the cream and the coffee mixing, and you get this complexity, and then it all becomes homogeneous. What I'm saying is, no, that's not true for the universe at all. Complexity keeps going, because when life emerges, it's not like some complexity, like you get some random pebbles arranged as a crystal, and then the wind blows and then they disperse. Life is robust. It's modeled the world, and it's because it's modeled the world, it can maintain its own existence. So, for example, if an asteroid's coming at the Earth in 100 years, assuming that we advance technologically at the rate we've been, we're going to destroy that asteroid. We're going to do what we need to do to preserve life, and that's going to change the deterministic trajectory of the inanimate world. So life changes the trajectory of the inanimate world. But what I'm saying, it was inevitable that life emerges and does this. So there is a sort of trajectory that's sort of set in stone from the initial parameters, but that this trajectory is the opposite trajectory of what Boltzmann thought. It's actually towards greater and greater organization. And the discussion of where's the limit, if this universe wakes up and the whole thing becomes this integrated computational system, when does it have to stop? What about the second law of thermodynamics? What about the energy needs? And I wrote an article for Noema called Life Need Not Ever End. And it was shared by David Deutsch, and Sabine Hossenfelder and Robin Hansen also were commenting on it and saying, yes, it's possible that life could potentially not have a limit. It depends on if there's an upper bound to entropy. Robin Hansen said, Sabine was like, I have a chapter on this in my book. So a lot of the things that we took as gospel, like the first law and second law of thermodynamics, those apply very well to certain systems, but we shouldn't have applied them to the universe as a whole. I mean, the first law of thermodynamics is just like, there's conservation of energy, which is holds, and we use that to calculate things. But the statement matter can't be created or destroyed, absolutely not true. Cosmic inflation theory has new matter and energy created during the cosmic inflation period continuously. And then now with the expansion of the universe, there's dark energy constantly being created as well. And astronomers, I mean, there's this astronomy conference paper where people have argued that we can use dark energy, and that's getting more speculative, to continue to power life. We might not even need that. If you read my article, you'll see this, but you can look up on Sean Carroll's blog. He has an article called Energy is Not Conserved, and it talks about basically the first law is not true in the way some people thought it was. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Let me go back to this slide. So let's speed it up. So maybe this is where we're at now. So it's a series of these stages. And what I'm saying is we're at this stage, and that the biosphere mirrors a brain. It's an information network of agents exchanging information through the internet. And that there's actually, people might say that's cosmic mysticism. Well, there's some interesting new theories by people like Lee Smolin and Jean Lanier arguing that the universe is a learning machine. And everything in that paper is consistent with this view. So go read that paper, read The Universe is a Neural Network by Vitali. He has a group on Facebook, and we've been meeting. We're taking a break for the summer and making some videos, but basically there's a mathematical foundation for this picture. And so calling it cosmic mysticism, it's just not true anymore. And you can have a fundamentally purposeful universe headed towards this, what Teilhard de Chardin would describe as like an omega point. And it's completely consistent with naturalism as long as you update naturalism to include these new dynamics. So I was going to talk about phase transitions. So basically these stages in cosmic evolution occur from components like nature's fundamental particles combining to make higher level systems. So we have, atoms come together to form molecules, which come together to form cells, which come together to form organisms and ecosystems. And then the biosphere is this fully integrated network. So those are phase transitions. It occurs in stages. We have a depiction here. We see a single-celled organism. And then those organisms, you can think of a slime mold. So you have a bunch of like paramecium or something, and then they need to solve a problem. And so they come together and they solve a problem. And they form a multicellular organism. So here's a slime mold and here's a human. And these agents also come together to form larger collectives. And every time you have one of these, it's called a phase transition. And it's exactly the same as the phase transitions. Not exactly the same, but the same category of phenomena, like when you have water freeze into ice. But we have these non-equilibrium phase transitions where you'll have like the emergence of a tornado, or a whirlpool in your bathtub. And basically these little units, like in the formation of a whirlpool, you have all these atoms that are bouncing around chaotically. And due to some thermodynamic constraints that we won't get into here, they start to organize themselves into these collective formations that create these flow patterns. And you can see these organized structures, and that life is basically another version of this. And that when atoms come together to make or subatomic particles come together to make an atom, like these phase transitions, they continue in the hierarchy of life. So you have agents coming together, single celled ones to make multicellular, then to make societies. And these phase transitions happen at this edge of chaos. So there's this sort of dialectical dynamic between order and chaos that creates complexity, and really everything is going through these cycles. So when there's a phase transition, you know, you don't want a system to be too stable because it's too rigid to transition to the next stage. So there will be periods of chaos like we're experiencing right now in society. And you might think that the world's ending, but it's actually an indication that a phase transition is about to happen. And so the system has the potential to either collapse or to transition into a higher state of organization. And so, you know, this shows these different stages. You have non-living, then you have it with living. You go from cells to multicellular organisms to tribes and cities, nations, and then to Gaia. And then it can even extend from, like, when we terraform Mars, that's the biosphere self-replicating. And so life will basically, the spread of life is like this higher level unit, that's the biosphere, making copies of itself with variation and selection. And then, you know, life would potentially, you know, I'm arguing inevitably subsume solar systems, then galaxies, and so on. So let's skip some stuff and get into the self-help stuff, since we don't have much time. Daniel, is it at 8? Do we have to cut at 8, or can we go 10 minutes longer?
We can go 10 minutes over.
We'll only go 10. I don't want to keep you too long, but that will help with the questions. If I can end at 8, then we can do 10 minutes of questions. Or maybe I'll try to end before. But so these phase transitions create these memory systems. So these higher organized systems, like life. So when we get the first cell, we have genetic memory, and that's encoding information that the organism, basically, that living things have discovered through evolution. So evolution is this process where it's making these different copies of these organisms. So there's a genome with some information, but it makes a copy, and that copy has some variation. So you get something different. And that difference, that organism might be better fit to the environment or worse fit. If it's a worse fit, it's going to die out. So it's going to be weeded out. That template of information is going to be weeded out of the population, and the organisms that are well adapted get to make more copies of themselves. So what's going on in this process is that you're building up information in an organism, and that information corresponds to adaptations. And so that information is information that is predictive about the environment. So organisms are performing inference from the very beginning of life's emergence. They're trying to solve a problem. It's how to stop this order to disorder transition. Basically, for an organism to stay organized, it has to find energy. And if it has to find, and that's what Schrodinger's book, What is Life, was showing, is that, you know, life resists this tendency to fall apart that Boltzmann described, because it captures energy, and that energy allows the system to do work that's keeping the organization. So with these phase transitions, you get different memory systems building on each other. So you have genetic memory with the origin of life, then you have neural memory with the emergence of brains, and then you have the emergence of civilization, and you get cultural memory. And then you get meme propagation. So you get a different mode of transferring information. And all of these memory systems build on each other, and they all encode predictive information about the environment that allows the living system to stay out of thermodynamic equilibrium, to stay out, to prevent falling apart. So one thing that is worth mentioning is this new picture of hierarchical emergence, this new paradigm where you have this multi-level nature of reality, where reality is organizing itself into these hierarchical levels, it has predictive power that the reductionist theory, any reductionist theories of everything don't have. Those are micro physics theories, and they don't apply to life. So those theories of everything, I would argue, aren't theories of everything, because they don't include life and civilization and consciousness. And what I'm saying is that that stuff has causal power. It's not epiphenomena. So those things, any theory of everything needs to include those things. Because they consider them epiphenomena, they go, we don't have to worry about it. But what I'm saying is those things actually have causal power and they need to be explained. So some predictive power that this theory has that the old model doesn't, this microscale model, is that we can actually use the dynamics of a system at one level to understand the dynamics of a system at another level, because they're isomorphic. They have similar patterns because they're all complex adaptive systems. So what I'm saying is that you can make predictions and you can use principles to optimize society that are the same principles at work in evolution that optimize organisms. And so we can think about, someone's asking, okay, maybe you accept that there's a global brain. You go, okay, we are agents. We're informationally connected. We're exchanging information the way neurons exchange, signal each other through action potentials. We must be forming this collective intelligence the way that there's an intelligence in the brain. And we know we are, because that's how we build rockets and stuff. A single person doesn't do it. We build on accumulated knowledge. We stand on the shoulder of giants and we share information. That's what science is all about. It depends on that. So if you want to ask how intelligent is the global brain, is the network of humans, then you can fall back on understanding the way that neuroscientists have understand brains and what leads to greater computational power in brains. Or what's the most robust design for a civilization? Well, what's the most robust design for an organism? Well, we want it to be hierarchical because you have this division of labor and all these other advantages that we'll talk about in a minute. But so my point is, this theory allows us to predict things that we couldn't predict before, because we are using a model of a similar system, of a complex adaptive system at one level, to tell us things about what hasn't happened in the future and what will emerge. And so there is there's an aspect of determinism here. It's not the same kind of determinism, but there's a global determinism where you get expected patterns at these levels. So we can get a glimpse into where the future is headed, but we can never know the details and we can never know what will emerge exactly, but we can see that these phase transitions happen and we will get new emergences. Talking about predictive power. So Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winning economist, said by 2005, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. Probably the most wrong statement that you could ever make. And so why did he make this mistake? Here we see it again. Internet may be just a passing fad as millions give up on it. Why did they make this mistake? What I'm saying is, if they had this framework that I've just outlined, we would have known when we saw the internet, this is a tool for interconnection. This is a tool for complexification. It's not going away. Maybe the internet would go away, but something else with a different name would replace it, because this is part of this trajectory that Ray Kurzweil called like the destiny for life. So without this theory, we will not see obvious things that would be obvious to us otherwise, and we'll make terrible predictions like Paul Krugman, and hopefully everybody reminds him every day of his life that he made that prediction. He's really into systems thinking, and so I think he would understand this, and I'm interested to know whether he got into systems thinking after he made that prediction or before, because if you see this picture, like Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere, he predicted the internet, 100 years ago, based on his theory becoming more integrated. So what does this mean for society? We'll mention some of that stuff before getting into the Bayesian stuff, just because it's here. Isolationism is bad. We want to be connected. If you cut people off, it's not good. There's no information exchange, and it could be good for your nation in the short term, but eventually what's happening elsewhere in the world is going to affect you, because it's one integrated system. So we want to connect to people because we want to open up channels of information exchange, but we also want to preserve nations. We want to have this hierarchical thing where there's control centers at all of these levels: towns, cities, nations, etc. So we don't want it to become a homogenized hive mind. Why? Because complexity is in computational power, it's a function of variety and integration. So something is more complex, has more computational power if there's more diversity among the parts, and if there's more connections between those parts. So that definition of complexity that lets us know if an organism is more complex, like a human brain is more complex than an ant brain because it has more neurons and more connections and more hierarchical levels. We can use that to create a more robust society. Now, what does this mean for you? It means life's part of a cosmic process with a goal. There's this cosmic attractor, and we're agents that are part of that, bringing that attractor about. This process allows the universe to wake up. So life spreading is the inanimate world finding a form that models itself. And slowly the universe starts to become this integrated network that's this coherent intelligence. So that's pretty interesting. Spiritual implications to that, however you want to interpret that. But when we're part of this, what does it mean for us? Okay, so this is the framing of the free energy principle. It says organisms are, so saving it for last, so it'd be climactic. So the free energy principles, it frames it with this Schrodinger framing, and Carl Friston, that's where he got it from. And it's also influenced by cybernetics. But if you look at that stuff, you have the free energy principle. Because it basically says all organisms will fall apart, all ordered systems. So free energy principle applies to aliens. Any organized system anywhere in this universe will have to, first of all, extract energy if they want to stay organized. The free energy principle doesn't focus on that, but even though it has free energy in the name, but I will focus on that because I think it should be a part of it. Organisms have to capture real thermodynamic free energy to stay in the game of existence. To capture energy from a chaotic external world, you have to start modeling the world. And that evolution is building a model of the world through variation and selection, through these accumulation of adaptations, and then brains do it even better. And then you can update the model in real time with brains because you have synaptic plasticity. You don't have, it's not slow where things have to die, and you have this phylogenetic learning, which is like the population is learning. This individuals can learn in real time, and so you have to model the world. And the free energy principle, that's what it says. It says there's reality, and it has all of these details that we don't know, and we have to create a model or a map of that world that's a coarse-grained, simplified version of that. And then that model is going to have errors. And so what the free energy principle and active inference framework says is that when we're doing actions in the world, those are like miniature experiments. And what we should do if we want to live optimally and stay out of thermodynamic equilibrium, if we want to survive and be robust, we want to decrease the difference between our model of the world. We want to decrease the error of our model, and we want to make it more of an accurate representation of the world. So you have reality, and then you have a model of reality, and you want your model to match reality as close as you can to be able to extract energy and avoid threats and to stay in existence, so we can be part of this continual process of complexification. So we only got 10 more minutes, but I think we can actually cover all this. So this looks really complex, but this is going to allow me to explain the free energy principle and merge it with evolutionary theory and even the process of science. So this is an organism. Imagine this is the first organism that emerged with the origin of life. And so this organism makes copies of itself, and you get all of these different designs, right? So these different designs are variations on this model. This organism is an embodied theory about how to survive, about how to stay far from equilibrium. So it has a predictive model of the world. That makes copies of itself, and you get all of these competing predictive models. And then these models compete for survival, and some die out, and the winning design is the best predictor. It gets to make copies of itself, and you get a similar design. So what's going on here is you have models that are competing models the way scientific models compete. And Bayes' theorem is basically you have a theory and you have competing models, and then you make predictions with those models, and then you test those predictions, and you update the probability that each model is true based on the results of those experiments. And so you want to update your model based on new evidence. And so what I'm saying is evolution, when you create all these organisms, these copies, and they compete, it's competing models the way that scientific theories compete. And the winning model is a product of natural selection, the same way that the winning scientific theory is a product of surviving criticism and testing. So that's a natural selection pressure. So as these generations go on, you get, with each generation, you get an update to the model. It's a Bayesian update. And so the model starts to match reality better, such that after a bunch of generations, you get an optimized organism that's optimized for that niche. And so this is how evolution itself is a process of Bayesian inference. As organisms adapt, they're updating their model. Carl Friston has understood this equivalence and says that all of evolution is inference. Of course, someone might say all inference is evolution, and it would all be equally true. But so this model applies to science and applies to learning. So instead of all these different organisms, which we said could be theories, different competing models, you could have this as different models of maybe you're trying to figure out how to play your sport, a sport like to the best of your ability, and you want to test out these different things, and then you test them, and one performs better. And so that's the free energy principle, is that you're decreasing the difference between your model and actual reality. So you're doing these little experiments all the time, and based on what works, you're updating your model, or you should be, if you want to optimize your system for survival and growth. And so it's the same when we're trying to find a political philosophy. Capitalism, socialism, these are competing models. We test those models out. This is variation and selection, and the ones that work, they get retained by society, and we keep those. So capitalism, I would argue, it's terrible right now, but it was the best model for the time. And the superior model is always going to be, it's never going to be one thing. It's always going to change. So we would want to test hybrids between socialism and capitalism and crypto economics. If you want to determine a political party based on this, what you would say was that the best solution for a political party is to try out different models in small areas, and based on what works, then you can see where to apply those models. But I would argue that it's not going to be socialism for every place. It's not going to be capitalism. It might not even be a hybrid. It might even be something in addition to that, like I said, crypto economics, and that we have to test these things. And if we're not testing them and we're not trying these different models, we're not living optimal. We have no way to get to the optimal worldview political philosophy if we're not doing this testing and Bayesian updating. So that's one big thing. Another thing that, as I said, this is a basis for a self-help system. So you have to model the world, and your model of the world, how accurate it is, determines how successful you are in life. If you don't have an accurate model of the world, you don't understand how things work. For example, let's say you take a bunch of physics courses, you can become an engineer. And if you don't understand how things work, and you're not paying attention to evidence, and you just have some sort of beliefs that you believe for no reason, and you try to get through life, you will not be able to achieve goals and progress in the way you would if you were doing Bayesian updating. So when I say this is a self-help system, basically I'm saying there's lots of inaccuracies about our model of the world that could be optimized if we took a Bayesian approach to reality. And let me tell you what I mean by that in these last few minutes. So we have 5 more minutes. So there's this principle of incomplete knowledge that comes from cybernetics. And it says there's this phrase, the map is not the territory. So our model of the world is not the same as the actual world. It can't hold all those details. The world is too chaotic, and there's just too many variables for any brain to model. So we need to have this low res, like coarse grained version of our model of the world. And it's going to be incomplete. It's always going to have uncertainty. So anyone who's certain about anything, like Sam Harris is 100% certain that free will can't exist, even though there's lots of well-respected people that know a lot more about him than neuroscience and causality that say that free will can exist. It's just bad to be that certain, because anybody who's been that certain in the past has been proven wrong. Everybody thought Newtonian mechanics would explain everything, and then we had general relativity, and now we see general relativity doesn't explain quantum mechanics. Every model is going to be proven wrong. So one thing to do is never be fully certain. Always take into account the uncertainty of your model. What should we do from that? We should consider all possible theories. We should consider, for example, when we're trying to explain something, we want to know what was the origin of COVID. We want to know, how did we get sick the other day? We want to know how dangerous it is to move into this neighborhood. When we want to try to understand like the origin specifically, like we have to consider all possible explanations, because if we don't, we're already setting ourselves up for bias and self-deception. So we want to be aware of the space of possibilities of possible explanations for a certain thing when making a decision. And then we want to map out the likelihood of each of those theories being true with everything we know. And we can't do this in everyday life. We don't need to. We have intuition about, what to do in a lot of simple situations, but with complex situations, like what person we should vote for, what political candidate, what political party we should support, I think you have to do this sort of Bayesian analysis where you map out every possibility. For example, every possible theory and explanation for something. You write down the evidence for each one, and then you use those theories to make predictions, and then you test them, and then you, based on the results of those testing, update your likelihood of each of those theories being true. And we're not doing this all the time. So let me give you some examples. So flat earthers, flat earthers think the earth is flat. They have these pictures where it's just flat earth in space. And, so if you go by this method, I'm not gonna rule that out immediately. To be a good Bayesian, you want to consider the possibility, because there's always going to be surprises in nature. Who would have thought quantum mechanics? Who would have thought superposition and entanglement was real? It's so weird that everyone would have said that was pseudoscience. They would have been like, that defies the laws of physics. We don't know. So we consider the theory, then we write down evidence for it, then we try to test it. So we can take a flat earther. We say, we'll do a test. So let's put you in a rocket. We're going to pay for this. We're going to fund this. We're going to give you a video camera. You and your flat earther friends, we're going to bring you up in a rocket. We're going to show you. We're going to look. We're going to see if it's round or not. Everybody's trying to really figure it out, because most of us haven't been to space. Let's say we take them into space, we bring them back down. They see the earth is round. They come back down and they still get on their flat message boards. Earth's flat. They drugged me or something like that. Some impossible thing. That person is not being Bayes optimal, because they're not updating their model of the world to be more accurate. So they're going to make mistakes. Let me give you an example, a final example of how I can give you some new knowledge from a theory that will immediately change statistical behavior. I want to show you the effects of like agency. So let's say you're completely ignorant to whether squids or octopus are intelligent. You just don't know, and you eat calamari at a restaurant every week. Sometimes you eat popcorn shrimp, and then you eat calamari. Let's say it's randomly. And you're a person that cares about, you're a compassionate person. So I have lunch with you and I say, neuroscience has shown that it seems like, squids are highly intelligent and they show all this complex behavior. They have these nervous systems that would seem to make them intelligent. Lead to this like computational power where they can solve all these problems. And I tell that person, if they're convinced of my argument, their statistical behavior is likely to change, such that if you were someone and you were looking at their eating pattern, all of a sudden you see them get this new knowledge, they update their model, and suddenly they don't eat the calamari anymore. Suddenly their appetizer becomes shrimp, because they go, oh, that's unethical. And then maybe they're kind of weak. Maybe they go, I love calamari, and they eat it like once a month instead of like every week or something. So what I'm saying is that there's a real power of knowledge that when you show the person that and they update their model, there is a statistical change in behavior that's quantifiable immediately. So that's the power of knowledge. Like we do have like agency, and we can actually see that people are not behaving in a Bayes optimal way. And we can see all sorts of, disagreements about for example, theories. If we did a Bayesian analysis, we could start to converge on what is the true answer for this. So it could be a solution to the misinformation problem. A solution to the misinformation problem is a solution to a problem in your own life. Basically, it tells you, how you need to update your model to be more accurate, and then you behave in a different way. You don't have these like delusions. So, there's you set goals for yourself in the teleological stance, because basically life, to stay out of equilibrium, has to have these intrinsic survival goals, like finding energy and avoiding threats. But when you create a goal, you basically create an attractor. And when you start working towards that goal, that is when you have a goal in your mind, you say, I'm going to do this for the world. I'm going to build this thing. That creates an attractor that you work towards. If you don't create that goal in your mind, you're actually not going to do what you need to do to make sure to work towards that happening. So goal setting is absolutely something essential. And if we don't do that, then we're not living optimally either. And actually, like the law of attraction, those kind of things that sound, like woo, and you're like, but they're these bestsellers. Why do they sell? Because we can actually start to map this onto this sort of like systems thinking, and you can see, oh, that's why this new age stuff worked. Variation selection is the method of evolution or learning or science. So we can use that in our real life. Like if you're writing a book or something, don't just be isolated for a year writing it yourself. Write a little bit at a time, pass it to your friends, get some criticism. And so that's a natural selection filter. They tell you what's not good about it. You go back, you change it, you vary it, and you give it back to your reading group. That's using variation and selection to optimize your writing. You can use this for any project. If we're not doing that, we're making life harder. Creating a collective mind. So I'm saying that there's this process at all these hierarchical levels. So when we start to collaborate with someone, we're forming a collective intelligence that then exchanges information for us. So we want to try to form collective minds. And that's when you're passing your book to your friend, you're doing that. You're forming a collective mind. And then you're doing an optimization process at the level of the collective. You want to align interests, so you find synergy. So basically you don't want to be opposed to others' goals. So if you all have goals, you want to look at what are your similar goals and not where you're conflicting. And then you will try to align those interests. So we could try to do some sort of analysis with China, for example, where we try to align interests and see where we agree before, rather than focusing on all of our disagreements, and try to make progress that way. And then the law of requisite variety is the final thing I'll mention right now, is that when you want to model the world, depending on how complex your niche is, your model matches the complexity of the niche. And so you will need a lot of accessible cognitive states if you're a theoretical physicist living in Manhattan in this chaotic world, where living on a farm or something. So you want to try to find the niche that matches your skill set. So you want to find low complexity niche if you're not a highly cognitive person. And if you are a person that thinks a lot and your mind is just always thinking, you might not want to live in a small town, simple, like rural town. You might, because you're not matched with the niche, you could be highly intelligent, but still you would be seen as crazy, because basically the niche is so simple that your model's too complex. So there's a lot of things that come out of this that I would like to expand on, but we don't have any time, and we haven't really talked about free will and everything that we talked about at the beginning. So maybe we'll have to do this again. But hopefully that was an introduction to this theory of everything, which creates this cosmic context that you're an agent in. The teleological stance is saying, I'm an agent that has to survive in a world that tends towards disorder otherwise. And to do that, I have to extract energy. And to extract energy, I have to model the world in more detail and more sophistication. As we run out of energy, we're going to have to model more and more of the world. So Bayesian inference is how agents basically carry out this process of cosmic complexification. So life is the mechanism for complexity increase, and we are agents with causal power, and we have to basically take this Bayesian approach to get to the future that we want to see. And if we don't take this approach, basically the world is on a sort of trajectory towards resource depletion. So this is actually like becoming aware of this, and this method is something that society needs to get us to the next phase transition. If we don't have it, we're not going to get there. So what I'm saying is that this self-help system, in a way, there's a selection pressure that's creating it. It might not be this version of it, but some form of this is sort of destined to be the next big thing. So everybody thinking along these lines, and there are other people besides me, keep going in that direction, because you're onto something. So, yeah.
Daniel, you jumping in there yet, or what?
I think, yeah, Brendan must have had to go.
Wow. Well, Bobby, I'll ask just 2 short questions from the chat just in our final minutes. So, first quick question from Ross B. What is the line between living and non-living matter?
How about I answer them in like a few sentences and we do a little bit more, but we'll still cut it early. So the line between living and non-living matter is agency. And agency comes from the causal power of information, and it gets built up through an evolutionary process. So you have an autocatalytic set, that's a self-maintaining chemical set, and there's some sort of phase transition between that chemical set and the first cell, where there's a change in causal structure, and the agent basically gains informational control, and it gains the ability to initiate new causal chains, and we call that top-down causation. So check out Sarah Walker and Paul Davies' work on informational control. Next.
All right. Very well. Second question from Ross. Are these phase transitions representative of weak emergence or strong emergence in Bobby's theory? E.g., do new laws come into play that exert downward causation?
Yeah, I wanted to address that, and that gets into free will stuff, and I would love to just come back and do a talk on free will. So what I'm saying is strong emergence has been defined wrong. It's emergence that seems to violate the laws of physics the way it's been defined. And what I'm saying is strong emergence is real, but of course it doesn't violate the laws of physics. Anything that's real is part of physics. So weak emergence would be more like the formation of like a whirlpool in the bathtub. Like you have all these, you have the formation of a coherent structure that does introduce global constraints that constrain the movement of the particles such that they're no longer chaotic. They're in this ordered state. But with strong emergence, you actually see this change in causal structure that I just mentioned, where information basically gains causal power, and you have an agent that's a control center that's actually deciding to do things, and that's actually real causation. That's called top-down causation. And so what strong emergence is for example, prior to life coming into existence, you have all inanimate matter. And when you have a living thing, we already said you drop a rock and a pigeon off a tower, one's predictable from Newtonian equations, one's not. One, you have to understand its genes, and you have to understand like its relationship to its environment. And then you can say, oh, it's flying because it has to survive. And you can actually predict some things about it. It won't splat on the ground. It's going to fly away, but you can't predict it with the same thing. So what I'm saying is what strong emergence is a change in causality such that we have living agents with informational control. And it's not something that's against the laws of physics or somehow working against that. What it is the laws of physics weren't complete. Now we're understanding that there's information that can have causal power, and you do see this different type of causation such that the living world behaves distinctly different than the non-living world.
Michael, the penultimate word.
Oh, that's put me on the spot, young lads. And again, Daniel, you know what's going on in the background, and I'm sure people will guess. But no, I think you know what Bobby and I had spoken about earlier was this comes down to what is our personal agency in terms of again, Bobby has spent a long time here, and I'm gonna have to like re-listen to it myself again and spend some more time with it. But we're elucidating, or Bobby is elucidating, what kind of agency we have in the face of complexity. And obviously, there's what we say before, Bobby, a methodology. There's a methodology to this. We had some kind of catchphrase, whatever, but
Yeah. So, well, the thing is, we do have agency. We behave different than inanimate systems, and we do have causal power. But that's not enough. That's like the first step. It's like, okay, we're these agents. Then what do we do? And the Bayesian approach is kind of an instruction manual for how do you exercise this agency optimally. And what we want to do is we want to be aware of the uncertainty in our model, and we want to try to decrease that uncertainty. And we do that by, for example, not just having one theory about something. We consider all possible theories. We consider the outcomes of those theories, and we make sure that we update our model in light of new information. And if we don't do that, we're not behaving optimally, and we're not fully exercising our agency. And you're going to see consequences of that at the societal level. And so society is basically creating pressures that are going to force us to be sort of Bayesian agents, because if we're not updating our model and not seeking out new information and being curious, we're not going to be competitive. But yeah, it's all about agency. It's all about saying.
I will add to this too, Bobby. Just know, to bridge the gap between the two of you, Daniel, and pin out the word for sure on my part, but you said act, infer, and serve, right?
Daniel said that. I like that. Yeah. Yeah. So all this is really saying new is that active inference is not something specific to humans. That organisms, when you have a population of organisms and evolution is making all these copies, the population is doing a sort of inference process. You have these different organisms that are different embodied models, and then they're competing, and then only the most accurate ones survive. So that's what Bayesian inference is. And this should also apply at the level of society. So when you have a social organism, a society, it has a model, and that model is its worldview. It could be a religion, it could be the political model, it could be authoritarianism or whatever. And so with that too, we want to optimize those models. And if we don't try all of the different models and test those models, we will have no way to know if we have the optimal model. So we can't just go, capitalism seems the best, or capitalism sucks, let's throw it out, let's do communism. We want to test things constantly and update, and that's error correction. If we don't do that, we're screwed. So the free energy principle needs to be extended to all of these levels. And when we do that, then we have a whole new way to go about optimizing social systems and political systems. Right now, it's just like, oh, I think this, I believe in, a liberal world, or I believe in this conservative view. And it's like, okay, fine. Well, how do we get to the bottom of it? No one's going to agree. First, let's do testing, constant testing. The proof is in the pudding. It's a good idea. We're going to see benefits. We're going to take surveys of everyone and get feedback and see what we can improve. And Vitaly Venturin, the guy who has the idea of the universe being this neural network, which has been covered by media, he's explained that this multi-level learning is consistent with this neural network theory, and that you do have true emergence and you have causal power at these higher levels. And he's trying to design a political party around this, like a new approach to politics. And that sort of position that I came up with, that you need to test it, without me even saying anything to him, that was already his idea that has fleshed out, I'm sure more than I have. So people are working on this stuff, but this is like a new niche being created right here. This is the time everybody needs to go, like, how can we use these systems, Bayesian inference and evolutionary science, evolutionary theory mechanisms, to optimize society? If we don't do that, if it's not entering the political discussion, we're lost. We're primitive. Like in 100 years, all of these things that we're talking about, I believe, will be part of the discussion for anyone who's having any sort of ideas about how to design systems.
All right, Bobby. Well, you're always welcome back for 15.4 we can push into decimal places unseen.
All right, let's do free will. Let's bring Adam and everybody back and do free will.
Free will and does voting matter? Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, it is. And no one's really doing that. No one's thinking that debate has, they think it's purely intellectual. It's not. Yeah. So yeah, we need to connect it to practical stuff. Yeah.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists and Bobby as always. So
I just
thanks,
want to
Michael.
say,
I
Daniel,
appreciate
well, both of you. Yeah, no, strength on the journey well to everyone listening.
All right.
see you later.
And I wish we could hear more from Brendan, but yeah, we'll follow up. Go to the Road to Omega Substack, and I'm going to post about this video, and then we can have some discussion in the comments if you see this. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Night.
Farewell. Bye.